Hi biologists, let's start by looking at the learning objectives for this lesson. At the end of this section and following the Leaving Cert syllabus, you should be able to explain, construct and use food chains, food webs and pyramids of numbers. You should also be able to explain the term niche, and you should be able to explain the limitations of the pyramids of numbers and make inferences from pyramid shape. What does this actually mean? What are we trying to understand here? You should be able to explain, draw up and use food chains, food webs and pyramids of numbers. There's no point in going into these terms until we understand them. You should also be able to explain the term niche. At the end of this section, if you are higher level, you should also be able to explain the weaknesses of the pyramids of numbers and be able to draw conclusions from their shape. Let's battle on. We're going to approach the learning of our ecology definitions or ecology terms like you would approach the learning of a new language. When you learn a new language, you have to learn your vocabulary. When you know your vocabulary, you can put it together and speak the language. The same thing here. When you learn your ecology definitions, you can put them together and then you can speak the language of ecology. It is vital to learn your definitions, therefore, and make sure you understand what they mean. Grazing food chains. A grazing food chain is a sequence of organisms, one after the other, in which each one is eaten by the next member in the chain. In a grazing food chain, the first organism is always a producer or a plant. P for producer, P for plant. Trophic level is another definition that we have to master. The trophic level is the position of a species in the food chain. Whether you are the first organism or the last organism, your trophic level is to be at the first level or at the top level. As we said, food chains always begin with a plant or a producer. When you are constructing a food chain, always try to make sure that you name the plant. Here we have the lettuce getting eaten by the slug. If we want to keep life easy, we can always start with something simple like a buttercup or a daisy. The slug is eaten by the thrush. It's terribly important that you would actually give the name of the bird. If you want to make life easy, you could use an example of a robin or a blackbird or even the common crow. But make sure you always name the bird. Do not just say bird. Another vital thing to keep in mind when you're constructing or making a food chain is the direction of the arrows. The arrows go from left to right and mean is eaten by. So it's terribly important that they point in the right direction. The slug is eaten by the thrush, so the arrow goes from left to right again. You can also have detritus food chains. In a detritus food chain, it will begin with dead organic matter. In this example, we have dead leaves. Now the dead leaves are eaten by, again the arrows going from left to right, by the woodlouse. The woodlouse is a detritus feeder. Another example of a detritus feeder would be an earthworm. And the woodlouse is eaten by the blackbird. Note, we have gone to the trouble of naming the bird. A trophic level is a feeding stage in a food chain. The first organism in a food chain occupies the first trophic level. The first trophic level is always occupied by a producer or a plant. This reminds me of history, where you might have thousands of peasants supporting a few hundred lords and ladies who support one king at the top. The producers are always the most plentiful level. They occupy the first trophic level and they produce the chemical energy from the light energy. The second organism occupies or takes up the second trophic level. These organisms are called primary consumers. P for primary, P for the first school that you went to, and P for producers and P for plants. So the primary consumers are the animals that eat the plants. The third trophic level is occupied by the secondary consumers. The secondary consumers, S for secondary, S for savages, they eat other animals. The secondary consumers following the primary consumers, like secondary school followed primary school. The fourth trophic level is occupied by the tertiary consumers. T for tertiary, T for third level follows secondary level. T for top. So the tertiary consumers are the top consumers. In this particular example, the top consumer is the hawk. This is because nothing else will eat the hawk. Now don't forget the scavengers and the decomposers like the bacteria and fungi of decay, and the detritus feeders like the earthworms and the wood lice. They will take food from each level of the food chain, because at each level you're going to have animals that will die and decay. Now, a pyramid of numbers shows the numbers of organisms at each trophic level in a food chain. They are used to compare different communities in an ecosystem according to the trophic level they occupy. What does this mean? Well, I like to think of it like this. Now, we all know that none of us feature on Ireland's rich list. However, if we lived in a really poor country, then we might be in a different position and might feature on the rich list there. So depending on the community in which we live, we can be at different levels in society. So the same thing applies here. At home, our friend, the rabbit, is at the second level in the food chain. Grass, rabbit, fox. However, if we look at a food chain from Australia, it could be likely that the rabbit is the top consumer. Grass, rabbit. It might be the top consumer in this ecosystem because nothing else will eat the rabbit. This is why they became a pest out in Australia, because they had no native predators. When constructing a pyramid of numbers, you have to count the primary producers or the plants. The primary producers or plants are then put at the pyramid base. There are a large number of these. This is why the base of the pyramid is so wide. Then you have to count each consumer, and the consumers are put at the different levels according to their status. So the primary consumers are put on the next level of the pyramid, the secondary consumers or the savages are put at the level above them, and the top consumer is put at the top of the pyramid, or the top of the pile. Hence, we get a pyramid shape on the pyramid of numbers. Another thing to be noticed about the pyramid of numbers is, apart from the fact that the number of organisms get less as you move up the pyramid or move up the food chain, due to the energy loss at each trophic level, But we also notice that the body size of the organism increases as you move up the pyramid or the food chain as well. So for example, the hawk and the blackbird are bigger than the worms and the woodlice. Now, if we are able for a bit more and attempting the higher level paper, there are a couple of more things that we have to keep in mind about the pyramid of numbers. The first idea is that the number of organisms at each trophic level will decrease as you move up the pyramid. This is because of two factors or two things. There is a high energy loss at each trophic level. Remember, only 10% of the energy in the grass will be passed on to the rabbit because a lot of the energy in the grass is used up in respiration. The rabbit then will only pass 10% of energy on to the fox. The rabbit will use up the energy in respiration, in movement and in waste. So there's very little energy left to maintain a top consumer. The organisms usually increase in size, obviously, the further they are along the food chain as well. This is because organisms tend to feed on organisms that are smaller than themselves. So obviously, the fox feeds on the rabbit is smaller than the fox. Therefore, in upright pyramids of numbers, the numbers of each organism at every trophic level decreases. Each level or each shelf in the pyramid is giving us a feeling for the numbers of organisms at each trophic level. Now let's look at this a little bit more closely. A pyramid of numbers shows the numbers of organisms at each trophic level. Now what's interesting here is if we turn our pyramid on the side like this, and then if we pull the labels down a little bit and leave them all on the same level, we will start to realize that a pyramid of numbers is rather like a graph or a bar chart. The highest bar will be due to the producers because they are the highest number of organisms. Then we can see the primary consumers, and then we have the secondary consumers. So this leads to an understanding, or we can see from maths, that what we actually have here is that we're trying to graph numbers. However, instead of leaving it in the shape of a graph, we turn it into the shape of a pyramid. This then explains why it can be very difficult to draw pyramids for all ecosystems, because how could we represent hundreds of thousands of grass plants on the same graph as one fox? So what are the limitations of the pyramid of numbers? Well, the first limitation is that the size of the organism is not really taken into account. If we look at this example here, we have one large rose bush eaten by a number of green fly upon which are living a number of mites. If we compare the number of mites, which are little parasites, to the rose bush, well, we've only one organism which is very, very large and thousands of tiny little organisms. So it is very hard to draw a proper pyramid when we want to keep this in mind. So sometimes we have to draw an inverted pyramid of numbers or one that is upside down. It's also very difficult to draw them to scale, because how do we put on a pyramid and represent, like in a bar chart, one oak tree, thousands of green fly, a few hundred spiders, tens of blackbirds perhaps, and then one hawk? It is very difficult to draw such a bar chart, or it is very difficult to draw such a pyramid of numbers. It's also very difficult to incorporate detritus feeders and decomposers and put them into a pyramid of numbers, as they do not feed on living organisms. This means it's often impossible to quantify or count the number of organisms that they might be feeding on. So in a nutshell, the limitations of the pyramid of numbers is that it's difficult to take the size of the organism into account, and it's very hard to draw them to scale. A food web is two or more interconnected food chains. Food chains, or food webs, show the feeding and the interrelationships in an ecosystem, and they also show the energy flow. You'd be well advised to make sure that you learn how to draw a food web. It looks deceptively easy, but when you're under pressure in an exam, it can be quite difficult to make up a food web on the spot. This is a very nice example because it contains normal organisms that we meet in our everyday life. What is also nice about this food web is that it contains an exceptionally long food chain. We have our oak tree eaten by an aphid. An aphid is another word for a greenfly. The aphid is eaten by the spider, who's eaten by the thrush. Don't forget, name the bird. The thrush then is eaten by the fox. The fox is a top consumer and can be picked out very easily on the food chain. We can also pick out a number of interconnecting food chains quite easily on this diagram. For example, the grass is eaten by the mouse, who is eaten by the owl. The oak tree is eaten by the mouse, is eaten by the owl. Another interconnecting food chain would be the oak tree is eaten by the mouse, who is eaten by the hawk, and the oak tree is eaten by the snail, who is eaten by the thrush, who's eaten by the hawk. So this food web has quite a lot going for it, and you would be well advised to learn it and practice it and have it under your belt for the exam when needs be. Now we need to understand the word niche. A niche is the functional role of an organism in the ecosystem. In other words, the term niche means what job does an organism do in the ecosystem, out in nature? What is its role? Well, an organism's niche or job might be, or might involve, what it eats. So it might be a ladybird's job or niche in the ecosystem to prey on the greenfly and keep their population number down. An organism's niche or job might include what eats it. So maybe the rabbit's niche might be to be present in the ecosystem as a source of food for the fox. The rabbit's role, or I should say the organism's role, might also involve how it interacts with other organisms. So perhaps it is in competition with the cattle in the field, and they are both eating the grass and keeping the grass plants down. So in a nutshell, the organism's niche or way of life includes what it eats, what it is eaten by, and how it interacts with other organisms and with its abiotic environment. Every organism has an effect on the habitat and on the ecological relationships in that habitat. For example, if foxes were taken from the habitat and taken out of that field, the number of rabbits would increase rapidly. This in turn would have an effect and other organisms in the habitat. As a result, the grass or the vegetation would be overgrazed. Therefore, the niche or the job of a fox is to keep the number of rabbits under control. Two species that have identical jobs or niches or roles cannot survive for very long in the same habitat either. Perhaps they would compete for the same food. This is a survival strategy that the butterfly follows. The caterpillar is the young of the butterfly, and the caterpillar will eat different food to the butterfly. The caterpillar will chew and gnaw on leaves, whereas the adult of the species will feed on nectar in the flowers. Organisms will survive in an ecosystem if they occupy different niches. For example, the thrush feeds on the ground and likes to eat snails. The thrush can share the habitat with the swallow because the swallow feeds on insects in the air. These two organisms can share the same ecosystem because they occupy different niches or they have different roles in nature. Now that we have reached the end of our lesson, can you explain, construct and use food chains, food webs and pyramids of numbers? Can you explain the term niche? If you are doing higher level, can you explain the limitations or the weaknesses of the pyramids of numbers, and can you draw conclusions from their shapes?